Hilchos Shabbos Perek Asiri, Laws of Shabbos, Chapter 10. We continue today the Rambam's examination of the definitions and parameters of the 39 Avot Melachot, the 39 primary labors that are forbidden on the Shabbos. The last two chapters, we covered the first 20 of the 39. Today, in Chapter 10, we cover the next 8. 8 different Melachot we're going to be discussing today and unpacking to understand what exactly goes under the rubric of these forbidden labors. And we begin with the Melacha of Kshira, the Melacha of tying. It says that Rambam Halacha Aleph HaKosher Kesher Shel Kayama, one who ties a knot which is intended to last permanently. V'hu ma'aseh uman, and it can only be made by craftsmen. Expertise is required to make this knot. Chayav, that is where the Torah holds you liable for tying, for knotting on the Shabbos. Two conditions. It has to be made with intent to last, and it has to be a professional level knot. Kegon, for example, says the Rambam, Kesher hagamalin v'kesher hasapanin, the knot of the camel drivers and the knot of seamen. There was a special knot that you would make at the top of the camel, where it would connect to the ropes, which would be used by the camel drivers. That knot in the beginning at the top was a very professional knot, and it was intended to last permanently. Same thing with the knot of the seamen. You see right next to the top of the boat, you have the knot that was made very professionally, which would then be tied to another rope, which was tied to the docks, etc. Those ropes were tied on a less professional level. But the main knot at the top of the boat, that was intended to last permanently, and also it required expertise. And the knots on the straps of shoes and sandals, which the shoemakers tie when they fashion the shoes and sandals. Later in this chapter, we're going to talk about the knots that a person makes on his shoes and sandals once they're already tied. But while making the shoes and sandals, at least in the shoes and sandals of old, the straps were tied to the shoe with a very permanent and professional type of knot. And the same applies to anything like this. That's where you would be held liable on account of knotting. But if you tie a knot that is going to last, but it isn't professionally made, it doesn't require expertise, patur, you are exempt. Exempt means biblically exempt from punishment, but rabbinically forbidden. If it doesn't meet any of the characteristics, it's not even intended to last permanently, and it isn't an expert knot, you're actually allowed, initially permitted, to tie it to begin with. Halacha bet ketzad, what would that mean? What would that look like? Nifseka lo ritzuah ukshara. If you have a sandal strap and it snapped and you tied it. Nifsak hachevel uksharo. If a rope tore and you tied it. Oshe kashar chevel bidli. Or you made the knot which ties a bucket to a rope. They used to get water from the well, so you had to use a bucket. The bucket would be tied to a rope. That knot, oshe kashar resen behema, or you tied the bridle of an animal. Here you see how a horse has this whole contraption tied around it, and it requires some knots sometimes. In all of these cases, these are examples of kesher shel kayama. You want the knot to last. When your sandal strap tore and you're fixing it, you want it to stay. You want this bridle to stay as well. So, nevertheless, since it isn't an expert knot, hareze patur, it goes into the category of things for which you are exempt, though it's rabbinically forbidden. And the same would apply to all similar knots. They're only acts of simple people, but they're meant to last forever. If the knot is not meant to last forever, if you were to tie it like an expert ties it, asur would also be forbidden. The only time it's initially permitted to tie is if it's neither expert nor permanent. So it turns out we have 4 categories. We have knots that are permanent and expert, that's where you're biblically liable. We have knots that are permanent, not expert, that's rabbinically forbidden. We have knots that are not permanent but tied in an expert fashion, also rabbinically forbidden, and a knot that's neither for permanence or by an expert, then it's totally permitted. Halacha Gimel, now that Rambam will tell us places where we might think it would be forbidden to tie a knot, but in fact it is permitted. Kosheret isha miftechei achaluk. A woman can tie the openings of her cloak, afal pi sheyesh lo shnei ptachim, even though it has 2 openings. So here's somewhat of a picture, hopefully we can understand it from here. In times of old, the women and men also in general, people did not wear fitted clothing. They used to wear cloaks, which would kind of hang loosely over the entire body. Such a cloak for a woman sometimes would have 2 openings. It could be buttoned and open on the side over here, and buttoned and open on the side over here. In each case, it would require somewhat of a knot to be tied down on each side. Now, technically, you can just untie one knot and slip it over the head and get it off or on. So one of the knots could be considered a lasting knot. A permanent knot, even if it's not tied in an expert way, is forbidden to tie. Says the Rambam, nevertheless, a woman could tie both of the openings of her cloak, even though it has two openings. Same rule applies, v'chutei svacha. One may tie the knots of a hairnet, afal pi shehu rafui berosha, even though it's loose, it hangs loosely on her head. And technically it could be slipped off without untying it. Nevertheless, when you make the knot, it's not considered to be a permanent knot. Same applies to knots that you make on your shoes and on your sandals on the foot when you wear them. Those are allowed to be made. Similarly, pouches of wine and pouches of oil can be tied together, even if they have two separate openings. And again, you could interpret that one of them is for permanence, because you only have to open the other one if you want to serve or store some wine or oil. And the same thing would apply to a pot of meat. Sometimes pots would have to be tied at the top. Even though technically you can take out the meat without untying the knot isn't considered permanent. You can also tie a bucket with a linen rope or with a belt and something like that, but not with a proper rope. With a proper rope, it goes into the category of halakha bet, a knot for permanence. As long as it's not a proper rope, we don't consider it a knot for permanence, and all of these knots that we just mentioned in the beginning of halakha gimel are initially permitted to tie. Another case of a knot that's allowed to be made is the following. V'koshrin lifnei behema o beragla bishvil shelo tetzeh. One can tie a rope in front of an animal. There you have a rope as a fence, and or tied to an animal's leg, bishvil shelo tetzeh, so it shouldn't go out from the pen. Afal pi sheyesh la shnei sarot. Here too, you may have two knots, and you can technically think that one of the knots will become permanent because you only have to untie one of the knots to let the rope down and hang loose. Nevertheless, it's allowed. If you have a rope that was already tied to the cow before Shabbos, you can tie it on Shabbos to the feeding trough. If the rope was before Shabbos tied to the feeding trough, you can tie it to the cow. What you cannot do on Shabbos is bring a new rope from your house and tie it both to the cow and to the feeding trough. There, one of them is a permanent knot is being created. But if it was a rope of a weaver who was anyways allowed to be moved, you can bring and you can tie it to the cow and to the feeding trough. We don't consider it to be a permanent knot. It's totally fine. The reasoning for the allowance of all of these knots is because all of these knots don't meet either of the criteria. They are not made by experts, they're made by simpletons, and they're not meant to last forever. Sometimes you tie, sometimes you untie. And therefore you can tie them initially. If you have bags in which you store dates and dried figs, you can undo the knots covering these bags. Mafkia is undo the string. Remember yesterday we learned that you can sometimes string figs over a string like a little necklace. So you're allowed to undo those cords, cut the figs, take them, and eat them. Halacha dalid, that's basically part of the laws of tying and untying. In this case, you can untie these knots because they're not considered to be permanent. Halacha dalid kol shera'ui lema'achal behema, anything which is fitting for animal consumption, mutar likshoroto b'Shabbat, can be used in the process of making a knot on Shabbos. So if you take grass or a reed that could technically be eaten by a cow, you can tie it onto your sandal, as we'll immediately say right now. Lefichach, therefore, im nifsakar etzuat sandalo bekarmelit. If a person finds himself in a karmelit, karmelit is one of those four rishuyot. There's four types of domains when it comes to Shabbos. We're going to be exploring them in detail in the coming chapters. Karmelit is neither here nor there. It's not a private domain, it isn't a public domain. It's rabbinically imposed some of the laws of a public domain, some of the laws of a private domain. So if you find yourself in a Karmelit and your sandal strap snaps, notel gemilach hara'ui lema'achal behema, you can take a moist reed, which would be fitting for animal consumption, v'korech alav v'kosher gemi, tie it around in place of the strap, tie down the reed, and that's okay. Nishmetal lo ritzuat minal v'sandal. Osha nishmat rov haregel, if the entire strap came off of the shoe or the sandal, or most of the foot. The sandal came off of most of the foot. Mutar lahachazir haritzuot limkoman ubelvad shelo yikshor. In this case, you can take the straps and actively put them back, as long as you don't tie them down. Just circle them or put them around the leg or back in the place where it belongs in the sandal without actually tying it down. Halacha hey, Everything we talk about until now is actual knots. Ha'aniva, what we know today as a bow, muteret, is allowed to be made on Shabbos, lefi she'eina mitchalefet bikshira, because it will not come to be switched with proper knots. Lefichach, therefore, a chevel shenifsak, if a rope snaps, mekabetz shnek tzotav, you can tie together bring together the two ends, v'korech alav mishicha ve'onev aniva, and tie around it a rope, and then make a little bow. Some commentaries say v'korech alav mishicha o onev aniva, tie a little rope, or you can tie the two strands together into a bow, so long as it isn't a full knot. I see here I missed the slide. This is the Arba Rishuyot Shabbat, the 4 domains: Shuta Yachid, private domain; Shuta Rabim, public domain; Karmelit, the in-betweener; and the Makom Ptur, the place of exemption, which we're going to learn about later in chapters 12 through 19. Halacha Vav. Mutar likshor kesher she'eino shel kayama lidvar mitzvah. You're allowed to tie a knot that isn't permanent for a mitzvah. We said before, even if it's a professional knot and it's not meant to be permanent, you're not allowed to do it. But if it's for a mitzvah, you're allowed to do it. For example, you tie something to measure one of the measurements of the Torah. The Mishneh Masechet Shabbat records a case where they did such a thing. They tied a knot and they lifted up a certain cup to measure certain laws of ritual impurity. So for a mitzvah, you're allowed to do that. Nimat kinor shenifsak. If you have a harp string which snapped, here you can see some harp strings that snapped. Koshrino taba mikdash avalo ba medina. So if they're in the temple where it was important to play instruments, even on the Shabbos, and we saw the other day that ein shvut ba mikdash, there are no rabbinic injunctions in the holy temple, so you're allowed to tie them back on Shabbat, because it's only a tie that's rabbinically forbidden. But elsewhere, outside in the country, outside of the Bet HaMikdash, it's forbidden, you should not tie it. Now, initially placing a string onto the harp in its original knot, in original form, that you shouldn't do even in the Bet HaMikdash. Halacha Zayin. Let's talk about the opposite of kshira. The other melacha is untying, hatara. Kol kesher shechayavin al kishuro, kach chayavin al hetero. Any knot for which you're held liable for tying it, you'd also be held liable for untying it. V'chol kesher she'akosheroto patur, kach hamatiroto patur. Any knot who a person ties it is exempt biblically but rabbinically forbidden. Same applies for untying it. V'chol kesher she'mutar lekoshero, kach mutar lehatiro. Any knot which may be tied initially also may be untied initially, because the two melachot of kshira v'hatara go hand in hand. Halacha chet, hapotel chavalim, one who spins cords, min hautzin u min hachelef, from palm branches and from love grass. This is called love grass. When the grass grows extremely, extremely tall and very thin, it can be spun into cords. That's michotei tzemer, michotei pishtan, chotei se'ar v'chayotze ba'an, or from strands of wool, or strands of linen, or strands of goat's hair, and the like. Harezet toledet kosher v'chaya. That's considered to be a derivative of the melacha of tying, and you're held liable. V'shiuro, how much has to be spun? Kedei sheyamod hachevel b'ptilato b'lo kshira. So much so that the rope, the cord that has been spun, will now stand on its own without having to be tied down. It's firm enough, it's wrapped taut enough, and that's already enough to hold you accountable. Because in that case, your labor has a lasting effect. If you were to undo this spun cord, that would be an offspring of the melacha of untying, and you'd be liable. Of course, in the untying process, your intent cannot only be to be destructive, because then you're doing destructive labor, not constructive stuff, and that's not under the rubric of biblical obligation. The amount that you have to undo is the same amount that you have to do, which means that now that you've untied it, it'll stay as it is without reverting back to its tied state. Halacha tet, we move on to the next melacha of tfira, sewing. Hatofer shtei tfirot chayav, one who sews 2 stitches is liable on account of biblically violating the Shabbos. Who that is, shekashar rashei hachut mikan u'mikan, that you don't just do the stitches, but after the stitches are done, you also tie the edges of the thread on each side, so the sewing holds and does not slip out. But if you were to sew more than 2 stitches, you don't have to tie it down. Even if you didn't tie it, you'll be liable because the sewing, at least the 2 stitches in the middle, will hold. If you pull a sewn thread taut on Shabbos, after you go multiple stitches up and down, at the end you have to pull the thread a little bit so it kind of flattens out. If you do that on Shabbos, chayav, you're liable. It's part of the needs of sewing. It's considered to be the act of sewing, and you are held liable. Halacha yud, the next melacha is the opposite of sewing. Kri'ah, tearing. Typically, tearing is talked about in the context of sewing. You undo some stitches to redo it back. It says that Rambam hakoreya, if you tear apart some of the stitching, kedei litpor shtei tfirot, al menat litpor shtei tfirot, in order Sorry, kadeh here means the amount of. The amount of sewing 2 stitches. In order to re-sew at least 2 stitches, and that makes it a constructive labor, otherwise it's just destructive. Chayav, you will be held liable for the melacha of korea. But if you simply tear to destroy, patur, you are exempt because you are being destructive, with one exception. If somebody tears his clothing or something in anger, or over a dead person for whom you're obligated to tear your clothing, chayav, you're liable on account of tearing, because even though towards the cloak, towards the piece of clothing, a destructive act was done, relative to you, something constructive was done. You calmed yourself down. You cooled your yetzer hara. Since your anger subsides through this deed, you're like somebody doing something constructive and you're liable. Somebody who opens up a neck hole on Shabbat of a cloak or of a shirt or something like that, chayav, you're also liable. That's called tearing, and it's a constructive tearing because you're opening up the place to put the neck. Some commentaries actually say that clothing used to be made where in order to demonstrate that it was still new, you would sew up the neck hole. And when a customer bought it, now he could open up the stitches. He would actually tear the stitches apart to show that it was his and that it was being used. So in that case, it's literally korea. You're literally tearing apart stitches in its most literal sense. Halacha Yud Aleph, hamedabek nayarot o orot. Somebody who sticks together papers or pieces of parchment, pieces of skin, bekolan shel sofrim, with glue of the scribes, v'chayotze bahen, or anything like it. Harei zeh toledet tofer. Gluing is a derivative of sewing. V'chayav, and you're held liable. V'chen hamefarek nayarot dvukin or orot dvukin. If you were to unglue papers that were glued, or skins or hides that were glued, v'lo nitkaven lekalkel bilvad, and again, your intent was not only destructive. Harei zeh toledet korea v'chayav, that would be an offspring of tearing, and you'd be liable. Halacha Yud Bet, we move on to the next malacha. Binyan, building. Haboneh, when a person builds kol shehu, even if he builds the minutest amount, chayav, you're held liable. Says the Rebbe, we have a wonderful hora'ah, wonderful lesson in serving God. When it comes to building something for a holy cause, when it comes to us building something in this world for Hashem, all we need to do is the smallest amount. The smallest amount is already considered you are contributing to the cosmic building of the dirah b'tachtonim of Hashem's home in this world. Hamashveh pnei karka babayit, one who levels the floor in his house. Earlier in chapter 8, we saw leveling the floor in the field is considered to be a derivative of choresh, of plowing. When you level the floor in your own home, you were to lower a mound or fill a hole or a ditch, that classifies as building and you are held liable. If one person puts the stone down and the other puts the mortar, so you're laying a stone wall, and if you were just to pile up stones, of course they wouldn't stand. You need the mortar in the middle. So hanotenet hatit chayav, the one who puts the mortar, he is doing the building act, and he's the one who's held liable. But on the top row of the stone wall, even if you simply put the stone on top of the mortar, chayav, you're already liable. No more mortar is going to be going on top of the stone. You did the last stone, you finished the act, you did something that qualifies as building. One who builds on top of utensils, patur, is exempt because it's rabbinically forbidden, but biblically you only consider it to be building if you're building on the ground. Halacha Yud Gimel, ha'oseh ohel kavua. Somebody who makes a tent that has permanent intent, it's meant to be there for a while. Harei zeh toledet boneh v'chayav. That's an offspring, a derivative of building, and you're held liable. V'chein ha'oseh kli adama. If somebody forms an earthen vessel, kagon tanur b'chavit, kodem she'yisarfu, you make an oven or you make a barrel before it's going to be fired in the kiln. You're simply forming the clay vessel. Here you have a small bowl, but it's the same point. Harei zeh toledet boneh v'chayav. That would be an offspring, a derivative of building, and you'll be held liable. You've already built the vessel, even if you didn't fire it, even if you didn't harden it. Somebody who makes cheese, that's considered to be an offspring, a derivative of building. But unlike the regular building, which you're held liable even for the minutest amount, when it comes to cheese, you have to make the size of a fig. The commentaries wonder, the Rebbe asked the question, the Ragachover Gaon asked the question, why is it that the derivative of building should be different than the building himself? Some have suggested it depends, again, on the context. When you build a building, even the smallest amount of building is considered to be building. When it comes to cheese, since the purpose is for eating, so like all other shiurim, all other measurements that revolve around eating, it has to be the volume of a dried fig. One who inserts the handle of an axe into its piece of wood. So actually this picture is not exactly accurate because here you have the blade coming around the handle. But Should be the opposite. It should be the blade having a little protrusion and that going into the piece of wood. So if you do that, harezu toledet boneh, that's a derivative of building. V'chen kol kayotzebo, anything like that, when you do something firmly sticking something into something else, that's considered building. V'chen hatokea etz be'etz, if you stick a piece of wood into another piece of wood, ben shetaka be'masmer, ben shetaka be'etz atzmo, ad shenitachel, whether you stuck it in by means of a nail, or you stuck literally one wood into another piece of wood in a firm way, till it became one, harezet toledet boneh v'chayav, it's a derivative of building and you'd be held liable. Halacha yudalid ha'osen nekev kol shehu belul shel tarnagolim. If you make a small hole in a chicken coop, kedei sheyikanes lahen ha'ora, so the light can enter, chayav mishum boneh, you're liable on account of building. Here, I looked online to find some chicken coops. Today's chicken coops are super modern. They have so many accessories. Many of them already have tons of space for light. But apparently in the olden days, it was customary to make kind of a blocked-in chicken coop, and you'd make a small little hole for some light. So that holds you liable, chayav mishum boneh, because in effect you're contributing to the building in a beneficial way of the chicken coop. Hamachazir delet shel bor v'shel dut v'shel yatzia, one who returns, puts back the doorway to a pit or to a man-made pit, a manhole, or to a little shed that's annexed to a building. Chayav mishum boneh, you're also liable on account of building. Here you have a manhole. Putting back the manhole would qualify for boneh. Halacha tedvav, we now move on to the next melacha, the melacha of stira, of demolishing. Hasoter, kol shehu chayav, one who demolishes, even the minutest amount, is liable. And again, v'hu sheyistor al manat livnot. It has to be not a destructive but a constructive act. You have to be demolishing in order to be rebuilding. Avalim satar derech hashchata patur, but were you to demolish simply in a destructive way, you'd be exempt. Now, if you remember in Perek Aleph, way back in chapter 1, the Rambam gave an example of soter, and over there he said when you destroy, you have to destroy kedei livnot bimkomo. You have to destroy to rebuild in its place. Here the Rambam doesn't say to rebuild in its place. Technically, he could be speaking about a case where you destroyed a house and you want to take the bricks and move them somewhere else. Your demolishing is still with a constructive intent. You want to rebuild, but you want to rebuild somewhere else. Does it have to be in place or not? The Minchas Chinuch writes that the Rambam over here is the main one. Here he's talking about the true law. You don't have to rebuild it in place. The Rebbe says, though, the first time the Rambam introduced the law, he says, bimkomo. So he leaves it with a tzarich iyun. We're not sure what the Rambam would actually hold, if you have to rebuild it in place or not. And many commentaries debate this issue, especially as it pertains to understanding the Rambam's opinion. Hasoter oil kavua, one who demolishes that permanent tent that we put up. And we said before that you're liable for building that tent if you destroy it. Oshe peirak eitz takua, or you undo this wood here, that somebody knocked one in wood into another wood. So the same way, making those things is a toledet, is a offspring, a derivative of building. Harezeh, destroying it would be toledet soter, v'chayav, a derivative of soter, and you'd be liable. V'hushit kavanat haken, again, you have to be having not just destructive intent, but intent to ultimately fix it and do something constructive. Halachat Tzayim, we move on now to the next melacha. Haka'ah b'patish, banging with a hammer. Banging with a hammer doesn't mean just banging with a hammer. It means putting the final touch onto something, as the Rambam will define right now. Hamakeh b'patish haka'ah achat. If you bang with the hammer, one hit, and one hit means the hit that's the final hit, and hardens the vessel, puts it into place, chayav, you're liable. The chol ha'oseh davar shugmar melacha, anybody who does something which is the final stage of a labor process, harezeh toledet makeh b'patish v'chayav. That's a derivative of this melacha, banging with a hammer, and you'd be held liable. Ketzad, what does that look like? Hamanapeach b'klei zchuchit, one who does some glass blowing. V'hatzar b'kli tzura, afilu miktzat hatzura, and one who engraves something into a metal vessel, even if it's only partially engraving. Here we see a man deeply engrossed in engraving a design onto a metal vessel. V'hamegared kol shehu, and one who planes even the slightest amount. This is planing a piece of wood. V'ha'oseh nekev kol shehu, and somebody who makes a hole of some sort, and it's the final stage. Bein be'etz, bein be'matechet, bein be'binyan, bein be'kelim, whether it's wood, metal, building, or utensils. Harei zeh toledet makeh b'patish. All of these classify as the offspring of makeh b'patish v'chayav, and you're liable. V'chol petach she'eino asui la'achnisu lehotzi. But if you made the hole as an opening, but it's not meant to bring in and bring out, it's only a one-way doorway, ein chayavin al asiyato, you aren't held liable for making it. It wouldn't count as makeh b'patish. Says the Rambam halacha yud zayin, hamefis shchin b'shabbat kedei leharchiv pi hamaka. One who pops a blister, a boil, on Shabbos with the intent simply to open up the wound. Kederech shaharofin osin, like doctors do. She'en mitkavnin b'refuah leharchiv pi hamaka, which their intent in the act of popping the blister is actually to widen the wound a little bit to allow for full healing quicker. Harei chayav mishum makeh b'patish. That holds you liable as one who is banging with the hammer. putting a finishing touch. Shezuhi melechet harofeh. That's the way doctors do it. Ve'im hefisa lo hotzim mimena halecha sheba. But if you were to pop it actually with an intent to get the pus out, harei ze mutar, then it's totally permitted. Totally permitted. Why not? Why aren't you considered to be making an opening over here? Makeh bepatish. So the commentaries offer a number of explanations. Number one, once you've taken the pus out, the doorway, this entranceway to the wound, cannot serve any other purpose. Number two, you're not even trying to make an opening. You're simply trying to reduce your pain. Getting the pus out will reduce the pain. And thirdly, this is called psikresha de nichole. So way back in chapter 1, when you do something that will unavoidably cause a melachat to be done, but you don't want the result, you don't want to be wounded, you don't want the blister to be open, you simply want the pus out. Therefore, we consider it to be less liable, and it's actually permitted initially to do it. Halacha yudchet hamisatet et ha'even kol shehu, one who hews stone from the quarry, cuts out stone, even the minutest amount, chayav mishum makeh bepatish, you're liable on account of makeh bepatish. Hamitzadedet ha'even biyisod ha'binyan v'tikna biyado, somebody who layers a stone into the foundation of a building, fixes it with his hand, v'hoshiva b'makom hara'uila, and places it in the place which it's meant to be, chayav mishum makeh bepatish, he is liable for this malacha of hitting with the hammer. Haloket yivolet shel gabe begadim biyado, if you take lint off clothing with your hand, like the lint that can be found on woolen clothing, chayav mishum makeh bepatish, is liable for makeh bepatish. But of course he has to be particular about them. But if he simply is removing them casually, harei ze patur, he is exempt. Hamenaer talit chadasha shchora, somebody who shakes out a new black talis, to make it beautiful, to remove all the white wool that's hanging and attached to it, as craftsmen do. Chayav chatat, you're liable on account of a biblical level to bring a sin offering. If you're just shaking it out, you have no intention, you don't really care whether the white wool stays attached or not, mutar, then it's actually initially permitted. Okay, I see here that they write in the notes that the yivolet that I translated before as lint actually has multiple translations. It could be anything which sticks to clothes. They say threads, straws, splinters of wood, any of those types of things goes into the category of yivolet. All right, halacha yutet, we move on to the next melacha of tzida, trapping. Halacha yutet hatzad davar shederech mino latzudoto, one who traps something, a type of living being, and it's normal to trap these types of living beings. Chayav, you're held liable. Kagon, for example, chayav ve'ofot v'dagim, beasts, birds, and fish. V'hu, provided sheyatzudotan lemakom she'eino mechusar tzida. You must trap them into a place where now, if you enter that place, you won't have to further trap them. They're so easily within reach. Ketzah, what does that look like? Kagon shadadaf acharei tzvi. Let's say you chased after a deer. Ad sheichniso lebayit o legina o lechatzer v'na'al befanav. You put the deer into a house or into a garden, or you have a deer in a house, or in a courtyard, v'na'al befanav, and you locked in front of him. Since in the Rambam days, houses were just one-room structures. Once he's in, he's in. Or you made a bird fly into a closet, v'na'al befanav, and you locked it. Or you got some fish in a bucket. They're now just there. You put your hand and you got the fish. They're within reach. You're held liable. This is called trapping. But if you were to make a bird fly into a house and lock it, a bird in a house, go catch a bird in a house. It's still got a lot of room to run. Or you made a fish move away, run away, and you got it out of the sea into a little pond of water, into a jacuzzi. You got to go catch the fish. It's a whole other trapping is required. Or you got a deer to go into a wide enclosed area. And you locked it. Here you're exempt. That's not considered a complete trapping. Because if you want to go take it in this enclosed area, you're going to have to chase after it and trap it again from there. Therefore, if you trap a lion, you're not obligated until, you're not liable until you bring it into its little pen, where it can be considered to be jailed. It has to be so trapped, so small, that if you just walk in, you can grab it. Any place that if you will run in it, you will reach the trapped beast or living being with one swoop, or the walls that are holding or that are encompassing this area, the space is so narrow that the shadow of one covers the other, harei zeh makom katan, that's considered to be a small place. And if you get a deer to run inside there, chayav, you're already considered liable, that's trapped. But a place that's bigger than this, if you get a beast or a bird to run into there, patur, you are exempt. Halacha chaf aleph, let's remind ourselves about the shmona shratzim. There are 8 rodents in the Torah: the weasel, the mouse, the toad, the porcupine, the chameleon, the lizard, the snail, and the mole, that are considered to be on a different level than other rodents. Says the Rambam over here, when it comes to trapping, echad, shmona shratzim ha'amurim b'Torah. Whether we're talking about the 8 rodents mentioned in the Torah, ve'echad sha'ar shkatzim u'remasim sheyesh l'minan seda, and any other type of rodent or insect that would typically be pursued and trapped, hatzad echad mikulan, one who traps any of them, bein letzorech, bein shelo letzorech, or lesachek b'hem, whether for a purposeful need or not, or just to play with them, chayav, you're liable. Ho'il v'nitkaven latzud v'tzad, since you intended to trap and you trapped. Melacha she'einat tzricha legufa chayav aleh, that Rambam famously holds, any melacha that is being done, even if you're not doing it for the usual intent that it was made to be done with, you're liable. If you trap a sleeping animal or a blind animal, you're still liable because they're sensitive to human steps and they could technically wake up and run away. You trap them, you impose yourself on them and transgress the melacha. For example, if it's disabled, for example, then you wouldn't, some say, because it can't do anything even if you wanted it. You send out your dogs to chase down, to trap some deer or some rabbits or anything like it. And the deer ran away from the dog. And then you are running after the deer as well. Or you stood in its way and you shocked it until the dog came and caught it. So you didn't trap the deer actively, but you got in its way to help the dog do the mission. That's a derivative of trapping and you're liable. Same would apply if you did the same with birds. You have a deer came into a home and somebody locked in front of it. Chayav, he is liable. If 2 people close the door, they are exempt because only one person is needed. But if the door is so big that one person can't lock it on his own, you need 2 people to lock it. So like we saw in chapter 1, when 2 people are required to do a piece of work, when they do it together, they're both liable, chayavim. They are held accountable. One person sits in the doorway where the deer is blocked in, and he doesn't fill up the doorway. Only when the second person comes. Now you got 2 guys in the doorway, and now the doorway is full. Hasheni chayav. The second guy completed the act of trapping, only he is held liable. Yashav harishonu mil'ahu. But if the first person sat in the doorway and he filled the doorway, so he already essentially trapped the deer. Uba hasheni v'yashav b'tzido. Came the second guy, sits down next to him, isn't contributing anything essential to the trapping. Even if the first person eventually stands up and walks away, and now only the second person is trapping in the deer, harishon chayav, the first person remains liable. The second guy didn't do anything. He can stay there till the evening, take the deer home with him if he wants. What can this be compared to? Somebody who would lock his house with the intent of locking it just to guard his valuables. And then poof, you see a deer inside. You didn't do anything, your intent wasn't to trap. Second guy sits down by a trapped door because the first guy already filled it up, the deer is already trapped by him. He's just coming in, locking a locked house. Locking a house with a different intent and then finding a trapped deer inside. If a bird came into under your garments, you can also keep it. Stay that way till it's dark, and it's permitted to take it home. You take a deer that's old or crippled or sick or small. I mentioned that before. The disabled animals, and you trap it, patur, you are exempt because they couldn't do anything if they wanted. If you untrap, release an animal, beast or bird from the trap, patur, you're also exempt. Rabbinically forbidden, but biblically exempt. If you trap a beast or a bird that's already in your possession, like geese or chickens, or they call this yonei aliyah, doves from a coat. Patur, coat is like the place where they live. Patur, you are exempt because it's already in your property. If you trap something which isn't usually pursued, kigon chagavim, hagizin, like certain types of locust, tzra'in v'yatoshinu paroshin, and hornets, and mosquitoes, and fleas, v'chayot sebel, anything like it. These are all small pictures of those bugs. That is a patur, you are exempt. Halacha chaf hey remazim hamazikin. But if you have insects or reptiles that crawl and damage, like a snake or a scorpion, here you have them actually fighting each other. But if you have a snake or a scorpion, anything like it, even if they don't kill, even if they're not poisonous, since they bite, mutar latzud otam b'Shabbat, you are allowed to trap them. Why? Because you aren't intending to trap something of value. You're simply trying to guard your health. There you go, provided that you're trying to save yourself from their bite. What should you do? How do you go about trapping them? Either you cover them with a utensil, or makif alihen, or you surround them with some kind of material where they can't escape this enclosed area, or koshran, or you tie them down, so they cannot do any damage. And with that, we conclude this chapter and the discussion of the laws of trapping.